could know the truth about the threat of climate change, would you want to know? This is the question posed by National Geographic, the film Before the Flood, which features Leonardo DiCaprio. And it's a great question. It throws down the gauntlet to potential viewers, as hitting the pause button would obviously answer with a decided no, although presumably you wouldn't have even purchased or clicked on the film if you didn't want to know the truth. But what is the truth? And as a filmmaker, how do you present it in about an hour and a half? Keep in mind that we're not talking about how to present one aspect of the climate crisis, such as wildfires or climate migration, but the whole shebang, from the fact that Miami is now flooding on sunny days to the disturbing fact that the fossil fuel interests are spending hundreds of millions of dollars trying to convince the public that the climate isn't even changing. The approach that the film takes is interesting and arguably effective. You introduce the audience to a protagonist, DiCaprio, who wants to know the truth about the climate crisis and sets out to find it, in this case by traveling the world in search of answers. Along the way, he talks with people as diverse as Barack Obama, Pope Francis, Elon Musk, and Dr. Suneeta Narain. Incidentally, Narain, who really takes the U.S. to task in the film for failing to lead in the crisis, is the director of India's Center for Science and Environment. In a sense, DiCaprio acts as a surrogate for the viewer, who also wants to know the answer to the question in which we opened. If you could know the truth about the threat of climate change, would you want to know? If you answer yes by not hitting pause, then buckle in, as you and DiCaprio are embarking on an epic whirlwind journey. Incidentally, the climate footprint for all this travel and production was, according to the filmmaker, offset through a voluntary carbon tax. This general approach is, incidentally, used by a range of environmental films, from Gasland to Cowspiracy. In Gasland, Josh Fox's family receives a letter from a gas company wanting to lease their property to set up a fracking operation on it. Knowing little or nothing about hydraulic fracturing, Fox then sets out on a journey for answers, with you, the viewer, along for the ride. Similarly, in Cowspiracy, you and Kip Anderson embark on a quest to learn about the environmental impact of eating animal products. And a little trivia here. DiCaprio, who has long been a committed environmental and climate activist, was the executive producer for Cowspiracy. In Before the Flood, the approach is somewhat different. Unlike Josh Fox in Gasland, DiCaprio's online persona is not professing ignorance of the situation. And hey, he hardly can, as early in the film he draws attention to the fact that in 2014 he was approached as the UN climate ambassador. Still, he acknowledges that, since he is hardly an expert in the climate crisis, he still has much to learn. He then sets out to learn it with the viewer in tow. Is DiCaprio really as uninformed as his on-screen persona? Yeah, probably not. Still, what do you think? Is this an effective rhetorical device? There are, of course, other strategies that DiCaprio could have used. We will see this directly with Al Gore. In both of his Inconvenient films, Al Gore takes an entirely different approach. Gore's 2006 documentary, An Inconvenient Truth, was a phenomenon. Although it is not in the top 10 highest-grossing documentaries of all time, it is currently number 11. Partly on the merit of the film, Gore was awarded the 2007 Nobel Peace Prize along with 1,500 scientists from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. That's the IPCC. Incidentally, Gore received half of that award, and those 1,500 scientists split the other half. A good deal of An Inconvenient Truth was given to establishing Gore's credibility. No, he's not a scientist, but since he has been working on the climate crisis since the 1970s, he also works with a range of climate scientists. In short, the film hopes to make clear that you should listen to Gore, as he is presented as an expert, the right person to deliver the message. Note that Gore is radically different from Leonardo DiCaprio in this regard, as he is hardly a surrogate for the viewer. In Gore's 2017 follow-up to An Inconvenient Truth, aptly named An Inconvenient Sequel, Truth to Power, the filmmaker takes largely the same approach by working to establish Gore as an internationally recognized expert. In contrast, early in Before the Flood, Leonardo DiCaprio wonders if the UN did the right thing in appointing him as their climate ambassador. As he baldly puts it, I mean, to be honest, they may have picked the wrong guy. So if you've watched Before the Flood and the Inconvenient sequel, if you've watched both of them, I'm curious to hear what you think about these different approaches. Incidentally, one of the reasons that the iconic and inconvenient truth is not one of our options is because a great deal has changed in the years since 2006 when it was released. For example, while Gore was correct in asserting in the film that climate change played a role in exacerbating Hurricane Katrina, and that's the 2005 storm that devastated Florida and Louisiana, killing 1,200 people, scientists now have a much clearer understanding of how this works. And sadly, there have been a range of horrifying storms since Katrina, like Superstorm Sandy and Hurricanes Matthew, Harvey, Irma, Michael, Maria, and Dorian. An Inconvenient sequel also takes on the job of introducing viewers to the politics lurking behind all this. Gore, who was a former vice president for 2 terms, is obviously in a position to know a good deal about the politics of the situation. And the politics is not always as clear-cut as we might imagine, as Gore visits a Texas city with a Republican mayor who firmly believes in renewable energy. The film also introduces the viewer to COP21, where the Paris Agreement was signed, by taking us there with Gore. So another little piece of trivia. After its premiere at the Sundance Film Festival, An Inconvenient Truth was edited to include Donald Trump's announcement that he would withdraw the U.S., which he did, from the Paris Agreement. And the film then also includes Al Gore's response. Before the Flood and the Inconvenient sequel are different films with very different approaches. Nonetheless, they both take up the formidable job of communicating the breadth of the climate crisis to viewers in about an hour and a half. So what follows now is the class discussion of Before the Flood and the Inconvenient sequel. If you've already made your weekly comments, I'm curious to hear your thoughts. As always, the following observations have not been paraphrased or altered, though I do correct the occasional typo, and because of space concerns, sometimes just part of the comment is reproduced here. So this is our first comment. On the first day of class, Ken stated that the first few weeks of the class are undeniably depressing, and this could not have been any more true. After watching the film Before the Flood, my shock and fear have been cemented due to the visuals that the documentary provided on the devastation already happening. I find it completely devastating and corrupt how the individuals and countries who contributed least to the problem are the ones who are suffering the worst. As a world leader it claims to be, the United States should be taking charge in addressing the issue and investing in solutions. Yeah, great point. Before the Flood does indeed contain some incredibly powerful images. A few decades ago, all that we had to go on were projections and mathematical models from scientists. Now, however, the climate crisis is here. Consequently, if you travel across the Earth, you will see its impact in one way or another nearly everywhere, which is, of course, exactly what Leonardo DiCaprio does in Before the Flood. And if you travel across the Earth, one thing that will be immediately clear is that the suffering brought about by the climate crisis is already unevenly and unjustly felt. This ranges from all sorts of plants and animals who obviously had no role in the crisis, yet are already suffering and in some cases going extinct. And then there are all sorts of people on Earth who did virtually nothing to contribute to the climate crisis. It's one thing to mention this as a fact, that the poorest 3 billion people on the planet are only contributing 5% of the greenhouse gases that human beings have put in the atmosphere. But it's another thing to see a farmer in India point to his field, which is entirely underwater, having been destroyed by a flood. Finally, we come to the cause of the climate crisis, the relatively small number of wealthy countries and individuals who are bringing it about, but ironically suffering the least, which of course brings us to the United States and this student's suggestion that we need to take charge in addressing the issue and investing in solutions. After all, how did the United States get to be so wealthy and powerful? Sometimes Americans think that this is just a natural occurrence, as we are imagined as being just that special. However, our success, power, and wealth came from 200 years of unchecked burning of fossil fuels from our fossil fuel economy. Hence, the only thing to do is to use our power and wealth to do what we can to correct the problem. In other words, because we are, more than any other country on earth, responsible for bringing about this crisis, we now need to take the lead in solving it. So the next observation. The climate crisis is a topic that has a tendency to make me feel like I am face down in the dirt with my hands behind my back. Through this, I mean that it feels like no matter what I want, how much I want to fix the issue of climate change, I feel like my personal actions won't amount to enough to make a significant difference. Yeah, lying face down in the dirt, hands behind your back. Such a strong image. I want to address this feeling, being completely and utterly helpless in the face of something unimaginably huge and seemingly inevitable. And not just as a response to our weekly documentary, but as a response to the climate crisis itself. I completely understand this response to what is bearing down on us. However, the goal of this class, Climate Crisis 101, is to, in a manner of speaking, untie your hands and get you up and hopefully mobilize. It's true that our personal actions won't amount to enough to make a significant difference, in the sense that if all of us gave up beef and driving cars, it would not be enough. It's not that it wouldn't be good to do these things. It absolutely, positively would. It's just that there are all sorts of actions that we need, can and should be taking. Bigger actions, political actions. However, because the required actions are so big, what could one person possibly do? This brings us back to that feeling of helplessness. But there is the possibility that one seemingly insignificant person can, in fact, do a great deal. Consider Greta Thunberg or AOC. Moreover, if you get enough people together, they can do amazing things. Consider the Sunrise Movement. The important thing is to try to do something. Aside from the fact that you may be successful, let's hope that you are, doing so is important because it can help reduce that feeling of helplessness. Seriously, it can. So our next comment. In particular, I really enjoyed the section when Sunuta Narain. I believe that it gives a completely different perspective on the use of renewable energy than those that are traditionally portrayed in mainstream media. While India as a country is the third biggest polluter behind China and the United States, it's important to note that per capita, one U.S. citizen is equivalent to 34 India citizens when it comes to a carbon footprint. I believe that Narain makes an extremely good point that the U.S. should be the leader when it comes to using renewable resources. Our country certainly has more financial means to do so, so it's unfair to blame developing countries like India when looking to carbon emissions. This is such a good point, and it's squarely on the mark. Having shown before the flood and to a number of students, nearly everyone's favorite part is, as you might imagine, the interview with Elon Musk in his car factory. Is not that, by the way, but rather the most popular part is the interview with Dr. Sunuta Narain, the director of India's Center for Science and Environment. Narain clearly takes DiCaprio and the U.S. to task for not leading in the climate crisis. So if we stand back and think about it, which Narain is in essence prompting us to do, it's rather absurd that the largest contributor to the climate crisis, the United States, is critical of the way that a poor country like India is approaching the situation. How indeed, by that I mean relatively poor, how indeed can we ask India to take action when we are not doing so ourselves, especially when we have the wealth and power to, for example, shift to renewables, which India simply cannot afford to do? Consequently, Narain and this student's comments are squarely on the mark. Again, the comment. Our country certainly has more than enough financial means to do so, so it's unfair to blame developing countries like India when looking at carbon emissions. Next comment. Watching the Fox News anchors roast Leonardo DiCaprio so viciously just for trying to bring attention to the scientifically proven phenomena and science of climate change was extremely disheartening. The way that the largest news corporation in America just constantly denies the existence of climate change in the first place sets the tone for how difficult advocating for structural change is in the United States. Elected officials purposely mislead their constituents to believe that this is a made-up phenomena and continue to make it, as a consequence, continue to make it a problem for future generations. It is a sad state of affairs in America today that if you attempt to pop your head up and call attention on the climate crisis, you present yourself as a target to smack down. Given his wealth and celebrity, Leonardo DiCaprio is an easy target. However, it really doesn't seem to matter much who you are, as speaking out about the climate crisis can open up you to ridicule and attack. When Greta Thunberg gave a moving, impassionate talk at the UN Climate Action Summit in 2019, then President of the United States, Donald Trump, tweeted that her speech was so ridiculous. Greta must work on getting her anger management problem taken care of. Then go to a good old-fashioned movie with a friend. Chill, Greta, chill. That was the President of the United States tweeting. Okay, so aside from the fact that the most powerful person on the planet openly attacked and ridiculed a 16-year-old, Thunberg came under fire simply because she was angry about the climate crisis. For being angry about the fact that Donald Trump and his generation of wealthy individuals, which brought about the climate crisis, were doing virtually nothing about it. In other words, more than anything else at the summit, an angry Thunberg was speaking to Trump, imploring him to do something about the climate crisis. His response was to ridicule her and to tell her to chill. This is all the more reason, as far as I am concerned, to respect and admire people like Thunberg and DiCaprio for having the courage to speak out. Before the Flood truly puts into perspective the depth and scope of the climate crisis. It also added to things I learned taking Environmental Studies 1, which I found insightful. I think that everyone should see this as it comes from a relatively neutral perspective, aside from being against oil companies. Overall, 10-10 watch and a harsh reality check for inhabitants of planet Earth. Yeah, there are two important points here. First, even if you're familiar with the climate crisis, for example, if you've already taken a course like Environmental Studies 1 at UCSB, there's always still more for us to learn. This includes nearly everyone, including me. And this is especially the case because the climate crisis, along with our understanding of it, is evolving so quickly. Second, the observation that Before the Flood takes a relatively neutral position strikes me as both correct and perhaps intentional on part of the filmmakers. As to why the filmmakers took this approach, I suspect it has to do with their imagined audience, something always good to think about. So Before the Flood was released in theaters on October 21, 2016. It was made available for free between October 30th and November 6, 2016 on the National Geographic Channel. Given that November 6th was the election day in the U.S. when Donald Trump was elected President of the United States, we can conjecture, and I admit I'm just guessing here as I don't know this for sure, that the filmmakers were hoping to influence at least some people who may still have been undecided to vote with the climate in mind. If your imagined audience are people who are not yet convinced of the validity or severity of the climate crisis, and who may, in fact, have already been influenced by arguments put forward by fossil fuel affiliates, taking a relatively neutral position makes a great deal of sense. In other words, if you just lay out the facts in a neutral way, as neutral as possible, given that the facts here are so compelling, it will allow someone who may be a little skeptical to make up their minds without feeling that they are influenced by partisan interests. Some people are immediately skeptical of Al Gore because he is a liberal politician. Consequently, it makes sense to have a relatively neutral spokesperson like Leonardo DiCaprio discovering a range of disturbing facts about the climate crisis. For this week's film, Before the Flood, I was expecting to learn a lot of new information about the climate crisis, but I never imagined I would have become this enlightened. It felt like I had personally joined Leonardo DiCaprio on his journey across the world to discover ways to make the changes we need. There were many statistics and visuals that I found very interesting. Speaking as someone who enjoys a good burger, when Leonardo DiCaprio addressed the agricultural aspect of climate change, I was fascinated by, but unfortunately disheartened. Yeah, so whenever I speak to the public about cultural changes that will be necessary to mitigate the climate crisis, I've noticed that sooner or later, for one reason or another, most people in the audience will, to use this person's phrase, go from being fascinated to disheartened. The issue here doesn't involve concern over impacts of the climate crisis, like sea level rise or wildfires, but rather what mitigating this crisis will require of each of us. In my response to the previous comment, I noted that technology will not, be enough to solve this problem alone. Rather, we need to engineer cultural change. This may sound fine in theory, but what does it mean in practice? For example, what if you are, as this person noted, someone who enjoys a good burger, or someone who enjoys air travel to exciting locales, or someone who really loves cars or really loves clothing? When I talk about these particular issues to audiences, when I get to the climate impact of air travel, some people in the room become visibly uncomfortable. Then the same happens for people when I shift to talking about automobiles or fashion use. Still other people become uncomfortable when I take up the subject of burgers. Unfortunately, as I noted in response to the previous comment, it's not the case that technology alone will solve the problem. One way or another, it will eventually hit home for all of us. Although it may seem that we need to give up things that give value to our lives, it's useful to think about the downside here. Experts argue that eating beef is not just unhealthy, but eating enough of it can take a year or more off of your life. Automobiles injure or kill over 50 million people annually. And is having a full closet of clothing actually making you happy? We'll take that up at this course, by the way. So the next comment. When watching Before the Flood, I went through a range of emotions. The film was overwhelming. It was infuriatingly frustrating and sad. I drew from the film that what we really needed to be addressing are big corporations and government. While I'm not trying to scapegoat them and to only blame them because we are consuming, fuel, their interests, corporations and governments, their interests. Corporations and governments have a much bigger weight on climate change than myself. The actions of big companies, lobbyists, and spineless politicians are criminal. This comment wonderfully and aptly cycles through a range of emotions and their causes. First, the climate crisis is overwhelming, as it is causing one major problem after another. However, shifting to the next emotion, what is infuriatingly frustrating is that big corporations and governments are not addressing the problem. The United States has known about the dangers of the climate crisis ever since the 1960s, when then President Lyndon Johnson addressed Congress about this issue. Since then, virtually nothing has been done about the problem. Regarding corporations, although it would be easy to just focus on the fossil fuel industry and its affiliates, all sorts of corporations are now powerful entities in the world. If Apple Computer were a country, it would be the 8th richest country in the world, surpassing Russia, Canada, Italy, and nearly every other country on Earth. Other companies, such as Amazon and Microsoft, are not far behind. Although this began at the close of the 19th century with fossil fuel providers such as oil companies and heavy industry like steel production, all sorts of corporations benefit from the fossil fuel economy. To put it simply, wealthy countries and wealthy corporations amassed enormous wealth during the era of the fossil fuel economy. Because carbon pricing, such as a carbon tax, was not in effect during this time, none of these countries or corporations were taxed or penalized for carbon emissions into the atmosphere. Moreover, it could be argued that during the last 40 years especially, corporations of all sorts haven't been paying nearly enough in taxes in wealthy countries like the United States. Consequently, as this comment noted, what is infuriatingly frustrating is that big corporations and governments are not addressing the problem. So the next comment concisely explains this frustration. Here it is. The capitalist greed for short-term profits will continue to hurt our future if policies are not made to crack down on corruption and enforce better actions, like with the carbon tax. We're going to talk more about this issue throughout Climate Crisis 101, but it's worth noting something now. Even though we will expand on this later, when people draw attention to problems with capitalism, it does not follow that we're suggesting that we throw capitalism out the window. Fossil fuel affiliates and climate change deniers will sometimes argue that calling for a reform to our current system is really a secret attempt to resurrect the failed communist experiments. And by that I mean Soviet Russia and Mao's China of the 20th century. However, what we are really talking about here is unchecked consumerism and capitalism and the significant role they are playing in hastening the climate crisis. In order to reel this in, we need a strong government, i.e. a strong democracy, to enact legislation to protect people on the planet from, to use this person's words, greed for short-term profit. Simply put, we need to put people and the planet first, not corporations or their profits. Next comment. I believe the film, and that's of course Before the Flood, was a great intro to the issue. However, more in-depth environmental films could also be used in adjunct. I wish I had time for more films that took up the range of environmental and climate issues. However, I tried to show films that were in some way just essential. That said, there are a number of terrific films that consider specific issues that are worth taking up, such as I mentioned Gasland, which is about hydraulic fracturing, also known as fracking, Racing Extinction, a great film about species lost, A Plastic Ocean, the polluting of our ocean with plastics, Chasing Ice, the loss of our planet's glaciers and ice, and Chasing Coral, the death of our planet's coral and coral reefs. Wish we could take up more of them, but just a limited time, and we just have 10 total documentaries for the course. Next comment. Before the Flood is a captivating documentary that I could barely take my eyes off of once I began watching. I'm not the type of person who cares a great deal about what celebrities are up to, what products they use, who they're dating, etc., which is why I was pleasantly surprised at how Leonardo DiCaprio presents himself in a humble and approachable way and learns and grows with the audience rather than coming off as pretentious. So Americans, have an undeniable fascination with celebrities, to quote this person, what products they're using, who they're dating, etc. Some celebrities capitalize on this by attempting to sell you the products they're using, either directly through their own brand or by advertising for a brand. Consequently, I too was, to quote this person, pleasantly surprised at how Leonardo DiCaprio presents himself in a humble and approachable way and learns and grows with the audience rather than coming off as pretentious. DiCaprio's celebrity may have been what drew people to this documentary, but he and the filmmakers do a great job of presenting him as just another person who will be impacted by the climate crisis. Of course, given what we know about climate change, he will still be impacted less than most people on the planet. Still, his concern is heartening. Given the enormity of the climate crisis, it's altogether surprising that more celebrities are not speaking out about it. And they're not. This is, I think, a very disheartening thought. In other words, once a person achieves celebrity, most use their platforms to sell some sort of product or another, rather than leveraging the platform to do good in the world. Surely many have pet causes, but it's rare to find someone with DiCaprio's commitment, as he has been actively working to educate the public about the climate crisis for more than 2 decades now. Next comment. While I agree that DiCaprio worked hard to travel the world for his film, we should be reminded that his travel adds to DiCaprio's carbon footprint. Yeah, I definitely take the point here, especially regarding air travel, but it's worth thinking about this sort of critique for a moment. In response to a previous comment, I noted that if you, like Leonardo DiCaprio and Greta Thunberg, if you pop your head up and call for action on the climate crisis, you present yourself as a target to smack down. Although there are various ways that people are smacked down, there's one in particular that's effective, and that's drawing attention to an action of theirs that is in conflict with the message. In short, calling them a hypocrite. For example, a climate activist flying on a plane or having a burger. In so doing, not only is the attack made personal, but the focus shifts from the message, which is often completely forgotten, as we start talking about the messenger. In terms of the climate crisis, as activist Naomi Klein succinctly noted, if you can't be an activist unless you have somehow purged your whole life of fossil fuels, then you're going to have a movement of 3 people. In terms of the previous comment about celebrity, it's doubtful that there are many celebrities living especially sustainable lives. Hence, as Klein further notes, calling people hypocrites is an incredibly effective way to repel potential activists. This form of attack is incidentally widespread. For example, the New York Post ran the story that, quote, gas-guzzling cars expose AOC's hypocrisy among Green New Deal pledge. As the article noted, and I'm quoting here, that even though a subway station was just 138 feet from her campaign office, AOC chose not to use mass transit, but instead used Uber, Lyft, and other car services. Yeah, if you look hard enough, I suspect that you will find that nearly every climate activist is in one way or another a hypocrite. Shifting from the message to the messenger is doubly effective. It keeps potentially important messengers out of the game. And if they are brave enough, or should we say foolish enough, to use their platform to help with the climate crisis, their hypocrisy will become the news story rather than the climate crisis. As we shall see throughout Climate Crisis 101, fossil fuel affiliates and climate change deniers have developed a number of highly effective and often vicious ways of shutting down the climate conversation. The following comment is made in response to another student who felt that Before the Flood was too much of an oversimplification of the climate crisis. So here's that comment. I agree that the movie oversimplifies the climate crisis. However, I think that what makes this documentary great is that it's made to draw people into environmentalism. My 57-year-old grandpa, who barely believes climate change is real, doesn't want the same in-depth 6-hour movie describing all the socio-political intricacies of climate change and the science behind it. That would immediately turn him off. A documentary that started with the Earth is its own autonomous being and we have disrespected it for long. But he sat through the whole hour and a half with me, and by the end, he had many questions. We literally talked about this movie and the climate crisis for hours. Without a movie such as this, which eases the viewer into the situation, he would have never listened to me. Yeah, what a wonderful endorsement of Before the Flood in this approach. Since this is the first documentary for Climate Crisis 101, it's worth noting that many people have observed that watching with friends or family not only makes watching more fun, but also leads to, as this comment notes, interesting and thought-provoking discussion. Because, as this comment also notes, our documentaries were generally designed to draw people into environmentalism. They are, relatively speaking, easy to watch, even for someone's grandfather, as they are neither too long nor are they too esoteric. So the next comment. Al Gore's An Inconvenient sequel was very interesting to me because it really resonated with many of the speeches that he gave. I really resonated with many speeches that he gave, especially the final speech in which he compared the movement to curb climate change to the women's rights movement and similar movements. A quote which especially struck with me was, "No other country can play the role that the U.S. can play," and that's in the movement to curb climate change. I think that America, a developed country with lots of resources and powers, should be doing a lot more to lead the movement that it's doing right now. While America is not stepping up to the plate in this green movement, other countries and their leaders are. One such example is Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Canada, who stated that, quote, and that's Canada's government, is making climate change a top priority. Yeah. Other countries are already well on their way to combating the climate crisis. While not without problems, Germany has been called the world's first renewable energy economy. Similarly, renewable energy in Costa Rica supplied about 98.1% of the electrical output for the entire country back in 2016. So in terms of wealth, and that's GDP per capita, Costa Rica ranks pretty low among other countries. It's number 50, and yet it has already achieved this level of renewable saturation. Independently, the GDP per capita in the U.S. is more than 4 times greater. So yeah, even a country without anywhere near the U.S.'s resources have been doing amazing things. So that's it for the first film. I tried to keep this relatively short, and I hope watching this film will get you not only interested in the climate crisis more, but interested to learn more about it. And we'll be doing that both through our readings, of course, through the lectures, but through 9 more films, or almost 9 films that you have coming at you. Okay, so that's the lecture. Take care.